Do you look for houses in certain, I guess, looking at the housing authority, do you prefer houses in certain areas because it has a really good housing authority in there? Do you do that?
Not so much the housing authority, because I'm kind of limited to the two that I have here. If you're in an area that's got several, then I think you definitely could. And I know that there's people even here in St. Louis that prefer one, and you will only take one and not the other. So you can certainly do that if it's allowed. Check your blah 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 whatever. But a big thing is that Section 8 rents are going to be capped based on what the local housing authority's payment standard for an area. Sometimes they do it by a whole metro area, or it could even be down at the zip code level. So for us, what this means, and this is going to be the case really around the country. So like in St. Louis City is a really good example. You can be in St. Louis City and the same zip code will have a huge variance in the quality of rentals. You have really nice high-end A rentals in one part, and then you have kind of not as expensive, Class C rentals in a mile or two away. So what I will do is go look up the payment standard for that housing, for that zip code, and determine like where's my ceiling at on rents, so that I'm not buying up in the A area where my Section 8 rents are not going to be able to keep up. So I do look at that. And then Section 8 is very interesting. The rents that they will allow are determined almost entirely based on the number of bedrooms. So the things in the market that get us more rent, granite countertops, totally rehabbed, basements, square footage, extra bedrooms, you get a little bit of a bump for those things, but very, very small. It's almost completely based on the number of bedrooms. So there is typically outliers that you can find if you tinker and look a little bit. So what that means for me is I want to try to find like the smallest house surrounded by big houses, because I'm going to be able to buy that house like it's smaller, but I get rents as if it's one of those bigger properties. But the opposite can also happen. And a good example is, you guys have probably heard of the town Ferguson. I own 4 properties in Ferguson. I love Ferguson. And the average 3-bedroom rent is like $1,000 in Ferguson. Well, I own a big 3-bed, 3-bath, beautiful, totally rehabbed property in Ferguson. Market rent's probably $1,350, but my Section 8 rent right out of the gate was only $1,115 because it's bordered all the way around by much smaller properties. So you just have to kind of test that out. And if you're in an area where you can get good rent comps through Rent-A-Meter and things like that, you can usually tell, am I going to be looking for kind of above comparables or am I in line? Because most housing authorities do look at market comparables as well, rent comparables.
Okay. In the case that you're getting less rent than what's market, do you then just say, okay, forget Section 8, I'll just put in a normal, but not normal, but I'll just put in a market.
A market tenant, you certainly can. I didn't. I kind of look at my portfolio on the whole, and I knew that tenant was going to be there forever. She had been at her prior place 10 years and was only leaving because they were selling the property and they made her vacate. Yeah. So I thought, you know what, I'll get my rent increases over the next few years, and what I'm losing in month-to-month rent, I'm going to make up for in hopefully never having a turnover. And she's been there a couple of years, and she just signed a 2-year lease. So, and she told me when I talked to her, she's like, I'm never leaving, just so you know.
How do rent increases work then?
I'm glad you got that. So Jennifer, did you submit for a rent increase on yours that renews in January, or when does it renew? Do you know?
It'll probably, yeah, I think it was just a year lease, so it'll probably renew in January 22.
Okay, so check and see, because every housing authority has a process for submitting for annual rent increases, but there's usually a lot of rules around it. It's very time sensitive, and they'll have paperwork, and it's usually very, very easy. You just send in the piece of paper, here's what I'm asking for, and you get it or you don't. My rule with my housing authorities, because the way they work is they're going to give you as much as they can up to like the rent comparables and up to the amount that you ask for. So I feel like if I get the amount that I ask for, I didn't ask enough. right? Because what'll happen is if I ask for $100 a month increase and they can only give me 50, then that's what they'll give me. But if I ask for 100 and get 100, I'm like, dang it, didn't ask for enough.
Yeah.
So just the bottom line is check with your housing authority. It'll probably be time banded in some way.
Got it.
So you might have missed the window, but you also might not have. But here we have a 30-day window every renewal that we can submit paperwork.
Got it. And so are you saying like the renewal or like the window to request that rent increase, is it a standard time period for anybody regardless of when the lease expires? Or
so the housing authorities determine that themselves. Like I've seen some of them in the country that say you can submit for it anytime after, like basically once a year after the first year, any time frame, but you can't do it more frequently than a year. So then you're not time banded. But for me here, it's 60 to 90 days before the renewal. So if you send it in on day 91 or day 59, it's going to get declined. But each housing authority has their own
got it.
little rules.
And so
Yeah,
how
I
does
was curious about that. Like how much does the housing authority approve, rental increases? And
That's another thing that they vary on really widely. I mean, I've gotten as much as $300 a month on an increase. So I bought in that package that I bought, one of them is just what I'm talking about. Little tiny 3-bedroom house surrounded by a bunch of big 3-bedroom houses. Those market houses were renting for like $1,250 a month, and mine was rented for $850. And I was brand new, and I requested $1,150 right out of the gate, and I got it. So that's enormous. I mean, that's huge, right?
yeah,
But ours here, all they do is they just compare it to market comps, and they don't limit it. But I have seen and heard of others around the country that will say we'll give you no more than 50 a month. So again, the answer is it depends on your
depends.
housing authority. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
if you increase the rents, does that mean that the portion that the tenant is paying is increased, and so are you still running into a risk that they're going to jump ship because of the increase?
Yeah, great question. So it's kind of a complicated question, but up to the payment standard, which is the maximum the housing authority will pay, as long as your rent is not going over the payment standard, the tenant's portion will still only be based on their 30% of income. It will not affect what they pay. If you're in a situation where the market rent comps support going above that payment standard, then they will grant that rent increase and the tenant has to make up that difference. So you do just kind of have to watch that, but they should tell you if you're going above the payment standard, which will then impact how much the tenant pays. But as long as you're underneath the payment standard, it does not impact the tenant's amount. The other thing that you can do if it goes above the payment standard and it puts them in a difficult position, you can always decline to actually implement the increase.
Well, I guess could you at that point say, well, what if I just accepted the increase up to your payment standard?
You could do that too.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do that too.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm curious on your opinion on this strategy that I did with my tenant. So, it was our first one. And so we're learning, how the housing authority operates when it came to approving the rent amount. And I'm trying to recall everything, but I believe, we were trying to get close to 1,000 in rent. They, I think, ended up saying that at least with this tenant we had approved that, they were only going to pay, let's say, up to close to 900. But if utilities were factored into it, then they would pay something around 1,250. And we thought, I feel like they're charging a lot for utilities for this house. Like, I feel like they're overestimating what the utilities would cost. So then we ended up deciding, well, we'll cover the utilities. We'll pay for the utilities. And so I worked it out. So we're doing that. And then we now get, up to $1,250 a month for the property. And I, thought to with our tenant, I was like, I did have concerns about, well, what if the utilities do go over, what we're being paid per month? So I was like, hey, if you keep your utilities at this amount, if you make it under that amount and we have an overage, like we're getting paid more than what we had to pay out, then we'll give you the difference, quarterly, so it's like a little, like little cash that she might get quarterly based on her utility usage. But what has your experience been so far? Like if you have covered utilities and
That's an interesting approach. The one thing I think the caveat I would say is just be sure that's allowed based on, because I'm not sure if the HAP contract allows you to do that.
Oh, okay.
Usually what I hear though, quite honestly,
Here's
is
a gift card.
I got you something. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I usually hear is that landlords have like a side deal with the tenant where the tenant's paying them more in cash than what the housing authority allowed in rent, which is a big fat no-no. So that it's usually the other way around that I hear it. So I'm not sure. I don't know if that's allowed or not. That's an interesting approach. My philosophy has always been, I don't want to pay any utilities because I don't want to be responsible for it. I don't want to have to worry about them using too much or, whatever. But it's probably just going to be trial and error. I mean, I agree with you. $350 a month seems like quite a lot for utilities. So you'll just find out, over time if that's true or not. And
got it. But for your best practice right now is to just not cover utilities. And
yeah, it's really more just almost like an ease of business thing. I think I just want fewer things to have to worry about. Yeah. So absolutely. I'm super curious though. I'm going to check back. I'll try to remember to check back with you in a year or two and see, how that's going and if the usage is in line with what you're getting in an extra rent.
Yeah. It sounds bad. I'm just now starting to track.
Yeah, we're all learning. So, I get it.
So I'm trying to get it all lined up of how much the utilities were for her unit, her property. And then I'm going to follow up with her and let her know like, hey, we're, you're not saving any money here.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting.
Yeah. So, okay, cool.
You said something very interesting earlier on, which is that housing authorities may sometimes pay over what market rent is. Tell us more about that situation.
That is when you have, it's that similar scenario. So it's easier if I can explain it. So this property that I have is in a town called Florissant. That doesn't really matter to you, but it's a 3-bed, 1-bath slab. It's like 900 square feet. So it's small. It is bordered all the way around it by 1,500 3-2s with basements. So this little house on the market might only get like $1,000, maybe not even that, because it's just so small. But because the housing authority only really looks at bedrooms, when they run comps, they pull in all those big house comps. So then I'm able, instead of getting 1,000 or 900, I'm able to get 1,250. Another thing is, again, like granite countertops and things like that. If you have a house that's not really been rehabbed, so it's got dated bathrooms or whatever, but everything around it that's renting out is nicer, more updated, you're going to pull in those higher comps. And so you're going to get more in rent from Section 8 than you would from market tenants.
Okay, got it. Okay, so it has to do with kind of just the comparables. I was in a situation where I was looking at a multifamily over in Aurora in close to Denver. And when I looked on Rentometer and when I looked, talked to property managers about the rents for this multifamily, each unit was, let's say it's about $1,000. But the housing authority, because they were all Section 8 tenants, they were paying about $1,200. And I asked the broker about it, and I guess she said maybe there's just less supply, and so they were paying people to take these Section 8 homes. And so when I did the numbers, she did it based on the current rents. And I was so worried that I wouldn't be able to get Section 8 or Section 8 would stop paying above that amount that I decided not to move forward with the property because the rents, the
market rents wouldn't keep up.
Yeah, it just wouldn't keep up. And the cap rate was super low based on that. What would you say about that situation? I mean, have you heard about that situation? And
Yeah, I hear little sprinkles of that around the country. So I have heard of situations where housing authorities will pay more. Exactly what you're talking about. Supply is low. Also, a lot of them will have programs where they're trying to move people out of low income areas and move them into higher income areas. So sometimes they will pay quite a bit more in those higher income areas than they would, in a lower income area. So I'm sure it's something like that where they're trying to motivate landlords to participate because they're having a supply issue or something along those lines. But I don't think you're wrong. I mean, the problem with that is that they could end it.
okay, that was my next question. So yeah, what's the likelihood of them just saying, no, we're not doing this?
That's the part I don't know. I think Denver's probably, and around there is probably a really good test area because it's just growing so fast. And what I hear, rents are running high and all that sort of thing. So I suspect they're having a very hard time keeping up, with their standard rents. So I just don't know for sure. But like our housing authority here just sent us a memo this week that landlords are gonna have to start covering the sewer. And I don't know exactly what that means, but potentially what that means is that I have to start paying for the sewer and keep it in my name and not bill that forward. I don't know for sure. I have a phone call into them to find out specifics. But if so, our sewer tends to run like $60 a month per house. Well, that's a dramatic hit in your cash flow.
Yeah.
If suddenly I don't get that $60 a month that I was getting before, I'm forking that over that I wasn't having to before. So that's one of the cons of Section 8 is that you do have this third party entity that has a fair amount of control over, what's happening. Now, from what I have read, Section 8 has never missed a payment. I think it's been around for like 40 years or something like that. So I'm not so worried about that, but they can, make changes. And we're talking about rent increases. If you're in an area where the rents are declining and you send in for a rent increase, they could give you a rent decrease.
Got it. Okay.
So
since we're talking about the cons, kind of what do you see as the cons of doing Section 8?
I think the cons from my perspective there are some additional administrative responsibilities with it. For me, the pros outweigh that. But if you're somebody that gets easily frustrated by bureaucracy and dealing with people that are sometimes hard to get a hold of and weird arbitrary rules and extra inspections, because you're gonna have that initial inspection and then you're gonna have some sort of an ongoing inspection. Some housing authorities do those annually, some do them every other year. Ours do it every other year. And what I find is that they're gonna fail you for something every single time.
Yep.
So that's their job, right?
Mm-hmm.
An inspector's job is to find something wrong. So our approach now actually is don't do any, like some people I see, like they try to prepare 6 ways from Sunday. And then I'm like, no, because they're going to find all kinds of stuff. So we actually leave things undone for them to find. Nothing major, but like, we're going to fix this anyway. Don't do it until this inspector comes through.
Okay.
But if all that stuff like drives you crazy, some people just like don't deal well with that, then it's not a good fit. And it requires extra detail orientation because there is extra paperwork coming through. The rent portions change at least once. So each year the tenants they go through a recertification where they have to send in new paperwork showing what their updated income is. And so every time the lease renews, their portion will change. So you've got to update your property management software. So I think that's the biggest con that I see is just that extra legwork.
Yeah.
And we had talked about before we had started recording, but we had talked about your background and kind of the career that you had prior to this and what led you to being able to handle, I think, the bureaucracy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I came out of corporate America. I worked for a large insurance company. And so, bureaucracy is like their mantra. Anywhere in corporate America, that's just the way it is. I had a friend that works at a big company and she says, it's like a bunch of ants moving an elephant. Like we're moving it, but it's just very slow.
That's great.
What's that?
No, go ahead.
But also it's predictable, right? Like the bureaucracy is very predictable. And so that I think was just a really good lesson in how to approach this. So what I've done is I'm a checklist person. Everything I have is like on a checklist system. So I have all these checklists that mirror the housing authority's processes, plus my own as well. And I think that's been really helpful. And like I said earlier, I'm not afraid if I send in an email and I don't get an answer the next day, I'm going to send another email and then I'm going to call. And then I'm going to call an email and I'm going to call the supervisor. Like that does not bother me. I don't get mad about it. Like but some people hate that. And if you hate that, this is not your jam.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you also touch on maybe a few specific stories that were learning experiences and hurdles?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the biggest thing I have learned is be very direct, polite and professional, but also like very black and white. This is the lease. We follow it every time. We do not deviate. If you pay late, even if you pay your portion late, the late fees are going to get charged. Don't come asking me to waive them. Like those sorts of things, because I have just found like you give a little bit and then suddenly, here we are off and trying to break all the lease stuff. I mean, so I'm very, very tight about my lease. That's the first thing. But specifically, I approved a tenant, and we're dealing with her move out. I approved her almost exactly 2 years ago. And it's not awful. I mean, I've definitely seen worse move outs, right? When I walked properties or whatever, but she's left a house full of stuff. She left a car.
Oh my God.
I mean, I'm probably, after her deposit, I'm probably going to have a couple grand out of pocket, which is not my goal. My goal is to be made whole, get the thing rented and moved on. But there was some red flags in her background that I shouldn't have approved her for. The biggest thing was she had very unstable residence history. There had been homelessness and there had been like 3 months here, 2 months here. So now one of the things I do, I didn't talk about this because I do this for everybody, but if they have not lived for at least 3 years in their last 2 residences, like if that time frame doesn't equal at least 3, they're out. So the unstable history is a big red flag for me at this point. And the thing that's a bummer is that this is not a bad person, right? Like she's not a bad person, but in order for her to take care of a single family house, it's a lot more than living in an apartment. I'm asking her to mow the lawn, clean the gutters, keep the landscaping up. That's a big leap for somebody who has never done that stuff on their own. And so that's why the time and the residence, is important. And I think she would just be better served in an apartment or, somewhere with a little bit more wraparound support than what I can provide for her. So that was a big thing. And then I was not able to get any rental history really on her because she had bounced around so much. So those 2 things in particular, I just had to learn the hard way that this is not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'd like to just share, like when you were talking about the inspections that you will always fail. That was like my big kind of wake up call of how it's going to be, working with the housing authority. We did our turnover and then had the inspection done. And I learned that you probably want to send out whoever does your turnover or whoever does your regular maintenance,
Yep.
have them meet with the inspector.
Yes.
Because the inspector was failing things that, twice, like, cause we had the inspection done, well, technically 3 times, and twice he was failing things that, he had pointed out the first time that we fixed. And so I was like, we got to get the guy who did the work out there with him. And then the 3rd time when they met, he's like, well, but that was done. Here it is. He's like, oh, okay. I don't know what the inspector was doing. Like, So basically he failed us for things that the guy had actually fixed. And it was just like, are so you even paying attention? Like, is it your job to just make sure you find something?
It is.
You got to pass eventually.
That's a change we've made in the last year is my operations manager. She goes to every single inspection. They go much more smoothly. A lot of times they'll say, just text me a picture of it being fixed. Or once they know her, She'll say, I promise I'm going to get it fixed, and they'll go ahead and approve it. And then we have
Oh,
to send in a picture later. So
that's good.
that's been huge, is to have somebody meet them there on
Yeah.
site. Also with the ongoing inspections, the annual or the biannual, I think it's called if it's twice a year, there will be things often that the tenant caused or is responsible for. And we do bill those back, period, end of story. And I do not have a hard time collecting them. So
Okay.
again, we just make that really clear to the tenant. I'm kind about it. Like, hey, this thing here, do you want to take care of it or do you want us to? And if they say, I will, I say, no problem. It has to be done by, I give them a week, right? This date, if we're going to have a guy out there on this date, if it's not done by then, we're going to do it and we'll bill it back to you. But I don't, and then I usually, depending on how big it is, I will give them potentially a little bit of, time to pay it off. If it's a larger repair, it may take them a few months to get it fully paid off. But I hear people talk about like they don't bill that stuff back, and we absolutely bill that stuff back.
Do you mention that in the lease at all?
Oh yeah, probably like 4 times.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in there a bunch. If any damage is done due to you or your guest negligence, we will bill that back to you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll have to make sure that's included in this next lease for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. Raina, did you have a final question?
I think I was about to wrap up like you are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask like one final question. I think that would be helpful. When people are, so as long distance investors, we like to research about the market.
Mhm.
And now that, if I'm going to acquire another long-term rental, I'm pretty set on always placing a Section 8. So if I'm going to start looking into other markets, what do you recommend the best way to learn more about the housing authority in that market? Are there any communities out there of network communities out there where you can get some valuable information from, or what should you research? Just like, what should you Google?
Yeah. I think what I would do, I haven't done that, because I invest locally, but what I would do is I would get on Bigger Pockets and I would just put a post in like, is anybody investing in Section 8 in this town? Because the housing authorities vary so much, it's going to be pretty dependent on how that one operates. There's a Facebook group called Section 8 Landlords. I'd get on there. I'd do the exact same thing. I would try to find almost all housing authorities that I've Googled across the country. They have a website and they vary widely in how useful they are. So I try to glean as much information from that as possible. I would also call. They usually have a landlord liaison, usually. And I would try to figure out, how are you all determining rents? What are your payment standards? What will you allow for rent comps? Because different housing authorities have different like softwares that they will allow. Like ours won't allow MLS or Zillow comps, but they will allow Rent-meter comps or Rentometer, however you say it.
Mm-hmm.
I would do all those sorts of things. And the biggest thing I think I would be concerned about, if you're not in a metro area, a pretty good sized metro area, would just be about the demand. But I think the housing authority would be able to let you know that, and also, local investors. Also, if you're going to post in either like Bigger Pockets or on a Facebook group, ask for people that like Section 8 and are successful, because you'll get a bunch of them that are like, don't do it. It's the worst thing ever. Those people are not helpful.
Because they can't handle the bureaucracy.
Yeah, exactly. It's just not their thing.
Yeah, most likely. Okay. And then I know you are a coach for people wanting to rent to Section 8 tenants. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you and find you and learn more?
Yep. So my website is section8educate.com, or you can always email me at jennifer@section8educate.com as well. I've got a YouTube channel also called Section 8 Educate, and a Facebook page.
Awesome. Well, I hope everybody definitely goes to any one of those sources to reach out to you. That I feel like you've shared so much, and I'm sure a lot of this information is just part of your coaching program. So we appreciate you offering all this valuable information. And so if anybody has questions, definitely reach out to Jennifer or go to her page or her website. And we will also be continuing the conversation on long distance real estate investors group. So we can start engaging on all the different markets and how they handle, how the housing authority operates there. I'd love to get that conversation going. So that's it for today. Thanks for anybody that tuned in to our educational webinar for the Long Distance Real Estate Investors Group, all about renting to Section 8. Thank you.